My name is Leah Donovan, and I was 32 years old when I sat in an estate lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon and learned that my parents had left 70% of everything they owned to my brother because, according to the will, he needed it more. I want you to hold that phrase for a moment. Needed it more. My brother Caleb was 35 years old. He drove a 3-year-old BMW he had leased the previous spring. He lived in a 4-bedroom house in a suburb of Columbus with his wife and their 2 children, a house his in-laws had helped him put the down payment on 6 years ago. He had a stable job in sales that paid him well enough to take his family to Cancun every February and post the photos without any apparent awareness of who was looking at them. He called our parents on Christmas and on their birthdays, and occasionally on Father's Day, which I know because I was usually the one sitting with them when his name appeared on the screen after weeks of silence, and my mother brightened in a way she never quite did when it was me calling, which was every Sunday without exception for 11 years. I drove a 6-year-old Honda Civic that I had paid off myself. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from my office. I sent money home every month, not because my parents asked, but because I knew they needed it, and because asking them to ask was an additional cost I could absorb. I paid their electric bill twice when they fell behind. I drove 4 hours to take my father to a specialist appointment when Caleb said he had a work thing. I sat in that waiting room for 6 hours with a sandwich I had packed because hospital cafeterias are expensive, and I was already stretching my budget to be there. The will said 70% to Caleb, 30% to me. Before I tell you what I decided to do, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where you are when you listen to this. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. I need to tell you about my parents before I tell you about the will because the will does not make sense without them, and they do not make sense without the particular dynamic that had been operating in our family for as long as I could remember. My father, Gerald Donovan, was a quiet man who worked in insurance for 30 years and came home every evening and sat in his chair and watched the news and said very little that was not practical or logistical. He was not cold, he was contained, the way some men of his generation are contained, the feelings present but managed, expressed in actions rather than words, which meant that love in our household was something you inferred from what people did rather than what they said. My mother, Patrice, was warmer and louder, and the social engine of the family, the one who organized and planned and kept track of birthdays and milestones, and who called the relatives and coordinated the holidays. She loved both of us, I have never doubted that. What I have understood, slowly and then all at once, is that love and equity are not the same thing, and that a parent can love 2 children equally while consistently treating them differently, and that the child who is treated as capable and reliable will carry more and be given less, and that this will be framed always as a compliment. Leah can handle it. Leah will figure it out. Leah doesn't need as much help because Leah always lands on her feet. I heard this my entire childhood, and I heard it my entire adult life, and I accepted it the way you accept a characterization that is not entirely wrong. I did land on my feet, I did figure things out, and so the characterization stuck, and the pattern it described continued long past the point where I had chosen it. Caleb had always needed more, not because he was less capable, he was not, but because he had learned early that needing more produced more, and the lesson had compounded across 35 years into a man who expected the people around him to orient their resources toward his requirements without particularly examining whether that orientation was fair. My parents died 8 months apart, my father first in January, a stroke that was sudden and that he did not survive, my mother in September, cancer that had been diagnosed in May and that moved faster than the doctors expected. I want to be honest that those 8 months were among the hardest of my life, and that the grief was real and complete, and did not have room in it, while it was happening, for anything as specific as fairness or financial analysis. I took leave from work in the final weeks of my mother's illness. I stayed at the house, her house, the house I had grown up in, and I managed her medications and her appointments, and the particular grinding administrative weight of a person declining, the phone calls and the insurance, and the decisions that needed to be made, and the paperwork that accumulated and required someone to be present and organized enough to handle it. Caleb came twice, the first time for a weekend in June when my mother was still well enough to be up and moving around, and the visit felt more like a check-in than a presence. The second time for the last 4 days, when it was clear we were at the end and when my mother needed, among other things, the comfort of her son, who she had always loved with that particular unexamined warmth she reserved for him. He held her hand in those last days. I do not begrudge him that. What I noted, quietly and without expressing it, was that the holding of the hand in the final days and the absence for the previous months existed in the same record, and that the record was fuller than the final chapter of it. My mother died on a Saturday morning in September. I was with her. Caleb arrived 2 hours later. We sat together in the house that afternoon, and I made coffee and we talked about logistics, the way people talk about logistics after a parent dies, because logistics are something you can manage and grief is not. He flew home on Monday. I stayed for 2 more weeks to handle the estate.
The will reading was on a Thursday. The estate lawyer, a man named Philip Garrett, who had practiced in my parents' town for 30 years and who had the careful, neutral manner of someone who has delivered difficult information across many decades and has learned to deliver it without editorializing, walked us through the document. The house, which had a remaining mortgage and was worth approximately $240,000 in the current market, was to be sold and the proceeds divided. The savings accounts, which totaled just over $90,000, were to be divided. The investment account, modest, built over years of careful, ordinary contributing, was to be divided. The division, in every category, was 70% to Caleb and 30% to me. Philip Garrett read the language of the will in the steady voice of a man performing a professional function. The language said that the distribution reflected the different financial circumstances of each child and the intention to provide support proportional to need. I sat in that chair and I did the math while Philip Garrett was still reading, which is what I do. I do math. It is how I process things that are happening in real time that I am not yet ready to feel. 70% of the liquid assets was approximately $63,000. 30% was $27,000. The house proceeds, after the mortgage was settled, would be approximately $110,000. 70% of that was $77,000. My share of everything combined was approximately $51,000. Caleb's was approximately $117,000. The man who drove the BMW and vacationed in Cancun and had not handled a single piece of the estate administration was receiving 2.5 times what I was receiving. I folded my copy of the will, I put it in my bag, I thanked Philip Garrett. I did not say anything to Caleb in that office. He looked at me once, a quick, assessing look, and then looked away. I drove home. The drive took 40 minutes. I did not cry until I was inside my apartment with the door closed, and then I cried for about 20 minutes, and then I stopped, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about what I was going to do. I want to tell you what I decided because I think it is the part of this story that people expect to be dramatic, and it was not dramatic. It was quiet. It was one of the quietest decisions I have ever made, and it was also one of the most complete. I did not contest the will. I looked into it briefly. I spoke to my own attorney for 1 hour, and she walked me through the process and the likelihood of success, and the cost in time and money and emotional energy of pursuing it, and I decided that the thing I most needed was not to win a legal argument, but to stop losing a personal one that I had been losing my entire life without fully naming it as a contest. The contest was this. I had spent 32 years being the capable one, the reliable one, the one who handled things and asked for nothing, and was rewarded with her competence, with more competence being required of her, while my brother spent 35 years being the one who needed more and was rewarded with his need, with more being provided. The will was not an aberration. It was the final and formal version of a pattern that had been operating since before either of us could articulate it. Contesting it would have meant arguing about the will. What I needed to do was stop participating in the pattern. So that is what I did. I accepted my 30%. I took the $51,000 and I put it in a high-yield savings account, and I did not tell anyone what I did with it. I called Caleb once after the estate was settled, a brief, practical call about a few remaining administrative items, and I was polite and efficient, and when it was done, I said goodbye, and I meant it in the full sense of the word. I did not call on Christmas. I did not send a card on his birthday. I did not reach out on Father's Day or at Thanksgiving, or when I saw his wife post a photo from their Cancun trip in February. I simply stopped. Not with anger, not with a declaration, not with a letter explaining my reasoning, because explanations are for people who have asked why, and Caleb did not ask why. He did not notice for 3 months. When he finally texted, it was a single line, "Hey, you okay?" I read the message, I put my phone down, I went back to what I was doing, which was reviewing my budget for the month, a budget that now included the beginning of a down payment fund for a house, the first house I would own, the one I was building toward with the quiet, focused discipline of a person who has stopped directing her resources toward people who do not notice them and started directing them to herself. That is my story. Not the dramatic version, not the version with a confrontation at the will reading or a letter that gets read aloud to the whole family. The version where a woman in her early 30s does the math, understands the pattern, accepts the receipt, and walks away. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.